An armed uprising in Russia has come to an abrupt end after the head of the Wagner mercenary group ordered his troops to stand down. Yevgeny Prigozhin abandoned his attempt to overthrow Russia's military commanders after striking a deal with the Kremlin. Wagner forces have now withdrawn from the southern city of Rostov-on-Don, where they earlier occupied the district military headquarters. Prigozhin says Wagner is pulling its troops back to avoid spilling Russian blood. The Kremlin says he will move to Belarus and all criminal charges against him and his soldiers will be withdrawn. And we can talk now to Nikolai Petrov in London. He's a researcher specialized in Russian politics who works for the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Nikolai Petrov, what have these past 24 hours revealed about Russia?
I think that results of the armed mutiny, regardless of how it will end at the very end, are very important, and they can serve as a game changer. And at first, it's understandable that if the very beginning of the war did demonstrate that Russian army is not that strong as it was considered to be, now we've seen that Russian state is absolutely weak, and not only it can't protect itself from something like what has happened, but it cannot prevent this. And moreover, it produces conflicts like the one we've seen very recently between Prigozhin and the political system.
Yevgeny Prigozhin looks like he's headed for exile in Belarus. For this, Vladimir Putin needed the help of his close ally, Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko. So what would you say who would you say comes out of this looking stronger, Putin or Prigozhin?
I think that the general view is that Prigozhin has demonstrated his strength, although the fact that he combines several important resources in his hands, military resources, media resources, and financial resources, does not make him the solid player, because the Kremlin can easily cut off his financial resources, not to speak about military resources. So Putin looks much weaker, and who did benefit from this, I would say, the party of those who are in favor of the escalation of the war in Ukraine.
It's said that Putin is not one to tolerate dissent, and there's already speculation that Prigozhin, to put it bluntly, could have a target on his back. Your thoughts?
Yes, that's right. And I would stress that both Vladimir Putin and Yevgeny Prigozhin are closely connected to the criminal world, or in case of Putin, KGB was an organization which was following almost the same rules of the game. And by those rules, it's very important to demonstrate elites who is the master in the house, meaning that Putin, who looks weaker now, should somehow present himself as the real master of Russia, which makes him, I would say, more dangerous than before this mutiny.
You're getting right next to my next question. Let's talk a little bit more about this. How precisely do you think this event might make Putin more dangerous? And how would that be manifest?
I think that now the war came to the moment when both sides should decide about their strategies for future, because neither Russian nor Ukrainian side do not look like being capable to radically change the situation. And in case of Russia, there could be three different options to be considered: status quo option, pacifying option, and escalation option. In terms of those options which remain, I would say that both status quo option, which due to all these statements made by Prigozhin, look very costly and devoid of any real results. This option is almost excluded, as well as specify an option because Putin is in a weak position, meaning that escalation option is, I think, the most probable one.
Prigozhin, as has been reported over the last 24 to 48 hours, was a very close friend in some respects to the Russian leader. And yet he openly declared a rebellion on the Russian state and made it as close as 200 kilometers to the edge of Moscow. Do you believe that this notoriously paranoid leader in Russia will clamp down even more now with the people who are close to him?
Yes, right. But first of all, I would like to emphasize that Prigozhin by no means could be seen as close friend or colleague of Putin. He was trusted servant, and he was doing dirty deals on behalf of Putin, on behalf of the Kremlin, and that's all. And perhaps the whole affair was connected with Prigozhin's plan to come to Putin's inner circle and to demonstrate that he can be very, very useful. But now it looks different, and Putin, who is extremely suspicious and who is very careful about his security, perhaps did learn a lesson and will become even more suspicious.
And what does that portend for everyone else who watches Putin and has to deal with him?
I think it means that repressions in Russia will become even more intensive, partly due to the fact that Putin needs to demonstrate his strength, not weakness, partly due to the fact that the Kremlin now sees how vulnerable it is with regard to potential, rebellion or split in elites.
Many here in the West have been rooting for Putin to fail and would like to see him go. Should the West be careful for what it wishes?
Yes, by all means. And if only to imagine that Putin evaporates now without any preparations, how the power could be somehow transferred, it will create very serious troubles. And what we've seen yesterday, I think, tells us about possible scenarios when not necessarily those who are in charge of huge state resources, but those who can operate in a pretty fast way and who can use military to fix their goals, can lead in this powerful struggle, which will start immediately when Putin disappears.
Our deep thanks to Nikolai Petrov with the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Thank you, sir.
My pleasure.
DW's former Moscow bureau chief Yuri Reshetto joins us now from Riga, as DW is banned from reporting in Russia. Yuri, what are you hearing about this morning about those locations which were briefly under the Wagner Group's control?
Well, Michael, day one after the armed mutiny, as Putin called yesterday's events, Russia is obviously trying to get back to normality as quickly as possible. As if nothing had happened, things are being downplayed that seemed so big and important yesterday. The highways to Moscow, which were blocked, will be reopened. The 10,000 square meters of pavement, which was damaged by Prigozhin's tanks in the Rostov area in southern Russia, they are to be repaired within 2 days. We hear from the authorities, and the buses are running as usual between the Russian capital and the cities that everyone was talking about yesterday, Rostov, Voronezh and Lipetsk. This is, of course, a very logical attitude on the part of the government. Just keep calm, make Prigozhin and his near coup forget as quickly as possible, and this is the most important thing, make President Putin look like a statesman again who can do everything again has under control. Yesterday, he didn't look like that, at least for a few hours.
Yuri, I have to ask you about those images of Wagner forces being hailed as conquering heroes as they left Rostov. They are striking. What do you make of them?
So we have many reports on the vehicles of the Prigozhin soldiers leaving the areas that they occupied yesterday, Rostov, Voronezh and Lipetsk. But we don't know anything about where Prigozhin is at the moment. There was no photo of him last night, probably one photo of him last night, probably taken in Rostov, smiling at his fans while sitting in the car. And people were celebrating because I think the one or the other was happy that somebody dared to stand up against the Kremlin. And also people were, of course, happy that the Wagner troops, Wagner soldiers, were withdrawing.
As part of the deal with the Kremlin, Prigozhin was to relocate to Belarus. What, if anything, do we know about his current whereabouts and what could happen to him next?
Well, once again, as for Prigozhin himself, we also know from the Kremlin spokesman Peskov, Dmitry Peskov, that he should go to Belarus and that he should be freed from any persecution, which is very, very strange considering that just yesterday morning he was considered as a criminal in Russia, as a serious criminal who faced up to 20 years in prison. So now, due to the deal achieved through Lukashenko, the Belarusian leader, we know that he might be in Belarus. Maybe he will move further in another country.
What are you hearing about what these events mean for Vladimir Putin's grip on power?
I think Putin's power has definitely been weakened since yesterday, Michael. I don't know if that was Prigozhin's aim, but Prigozhin showed that something is very wrong in the Russian state. In a country where people can be put behind bars for years if they protest against the power of the state. In a country where many don't even dare to criticize the Kremlin in their kitchens or in the metro, in the subway. In this country, one man takes up arms in hand and makes demands. Of course, he is not alone, or he was not alone. Behind him were thousands of other men with guns in their hands. But Prigozhin is not part of the Russian bureaucratic system. He has no government behind him and no parties, political parties. And suddenly, President Putin himself is asking his colleague Lukashenko from Belarus to negotiate with him. And suddenly, everyone is talking about a possible fall of Putin, and suddenly this solid pyramid of power doesn't look so solid anymore.
Lastly, I am curious about how all of this is being reported on in Russia itself.
Many people, especially of my generation, remember the 1990s when the then Soviet President Gorbachev was being held in Crimea and there was an attempt coup. At that time, Michael, Tchaikovsky's ballet Swan Lake was shown continuously on Soviet television. This time, the moderator of the Russian state television appeared in the night and interrupted the current program to report on Prigozhin, and the next morning, the president appeared in front of the cameras. That was state propaganda, which no longer knew how to deal with someone who the day before yesterday was being celebrated as a hero of Russia. But there were a lot of videos and information on social media, of course, and of course people found it out there, above all via the messenger telegram, which, by the way, was allegedly partially broken in some regions, but only partially.
DW's Yuri Reshetto, many thanks as always.